Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a video on my spoiler thoughts for the Lord of the Jungle series published by Dynamite Comics. This is an officially licensed Tarzan comic that was written by Jurgens and drawn by Benito, Gallego. And this is going to be wall-to-wall spoilers, so if you haven't read it, you can check out my non-spoiler reviews. I've done reviews on each of the issues. We're going to be taking all 6 issues here and just talking about the things that stood out to me. So we've got a lot of territory to cover, so let's get started. And just to lay the groundwork, this is a new version of the origin, and this is a more grounded version of the origin, a little bit more realistic, but it still retains all of the iconic Tarzan things that we've come to know and love about the character, as you're about to see. And so let's start with the framing sequences that are in each issue. They star Old Man Tarzan, and again, keeping with the grounded nature, this is a bit different than in the novels where he finds the secret of extended youth. And so we haven't really gotten to see him like this in Tarzan stories. So this is interesting, and I like it because it's different, right? This doesn't stop anyone else, any other comic series or novel or story from using the idea of an immortal Tarzan. But every once in a while, when you're a 100-year-old character, it's nice to do something different. This sequence is set in the 1950s. Tarzan is returning to an unnamed country in Africa after a good many years, and he swore never to return. We don't know why, but we do know that there is a price on his head that is quite hefty. We don't know who put the bounty on there or why. When Tarzan was young, he was forced to steal some jewels from a lost civilization, and he's finally found them in a museum when he's old, and so he decides to go steal them, which of course is illegal. Tarzan's just trying to return the jewels to their rightful owners, but the police of course don't care, and this gets him into a good bit of conflict with them, kind of reminiscent of Return of the Dark Knight, but also has some very iconic Tarzan imagery of him taking on a whole mob of men just by himself. Tarzan is helped by his African friend Bwanga, who almost acts as a partner in these sequences, and that's kind of nice because it helps kind of balance out the Bwanga we'll see when he's younger, who essentially acts as a damsel in distress for the main story. So how old is Old Man Tarzan in these sequences? We don't know. The comic says he was born in the late 19th century, but doesn't give a year. And the 5th issue, after a bit of a time gap, says it takes place in 1959. Now, if we're going by the original novels, Tarzan was born in 1888. And so in 1959, that would make him age 70, which is a pretty plausible age for him to have gray hair and still be able to kick ass. I can tell you from personal experience, my dad in his early 70s could ride an amazing amount of miles on his bicycle. All right, so let's get to the meat of this sandwich, the main story set during Tarzan's youth, which tells this new version of his origin. And so we begin with Tarzan's parents stranded on the shores of Africa after a mutiny on their boat. And so that's straight out of the novel, but they actually get on the boat for a different reason than the novel. So Tarzan's father goes on this expedition, taking his wife with him, to prove himself to his grandfather that he's worthy of the title of Greystoke. This is different than the novels, which has his father accepting a mission to go to Africa to investigate wrongdoings by European power there. And this is something that is oftentimes either left out or ignored in adaptations of Tarzan of the Apes or changed for big screen origins of Tarzan. And that's fine because according to the novel, because Tarzan's father never reached his destination or conducted that investigation, then it's of no importance to the origin story in the novel, and so it's fine to change when you're adapting it. From there, things proceed like the novels. They try to live in the jungle. Tarzan's mom gives birth to Tarzan, and of course the apes come across his parents, and we have this really cool looking Kerchak. I love the scar, makes him very distinctive and very interesting looking. Like in the novels, Tarzan's mom dies of natural causes, but then Tarzan's dad accidentally shoots Kerchak, which provokes the ape into attacking and killing him. And then the kindly she-ape Kala comes in carrying her stillborn son and takes baby Tarzan in his place. This is different from the novel where Kerchak and the males of his tribe would go into these psychotic furies and would go on these violent rampages, and that's how Kala's son died in the novels, and that's also how Tarzan's father died in that scene. Keeping with the more grounded nature of this series, we're showing more realistic animal behavior, and this is going to pay off in some really fun ways later in the series. But what it does overall is it creates a very sharp contrast between man and beast. So in the novels, one of the themes was the difference between man and beast. And in novels like Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, which is no relation to the comic series, Burroughs would go on and on about how bad men are, right? How we have all these more highly defined negative and evil traits than is found in the animals. However, Burroughs would oftentimes show the Mangani or the great ape as having those negative traits that he would say were unique to man. Now, oftentimes he would say that the Mangani were human-like, but I do like the idea of just having a very stark contrast between savage but innocent animals and more intelligent but more capable of evil humans. And then we get a really neat splash page showing Tarzan's childhood, which is pretty much straight out of the novels, including the dum-dum, which we see down here with Tarzan dancing with the apes. And like in the novels, Tarzan's first encounter with man is still him observing the Africans. And so this is our first appearance of Bawanga as we see him when he was young. And notice that he's wearing shorts as opposed to the loincloths that were worn by the Africans in the novels. And so this will encourage Tarzan to create his own clothing and give us jungle briefs for this series. So in the novel, this doesn't happen until Tarzan's in his late teens. I think it's moved up here in order to get him into some clothing and make the story a little bit easier to draw, which is understandable. The Africans here are portrayed in a much more realistic manner that, Tarzan would have been more likely to have encountered if he'd been a real person back in that time period, both in their dress and in their behavior, right? They're not running around in loincloths. They're not cannibals like the tribe of Mbonga was in Tarzan of the Apes. But don't worry, we'll still be seeing some Africans who live as their ancestors did a little bit later in the story. Tarzan does know he has white skin and does recognize people who have a similar skin tone to him in the story, but we won't talk about race in the same way that we did in novels, where Burroughs was oftentimes going on about the differences between white people and black people. For instance, in Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, he not only talks about how bad humans are, but specifically how white men were the worst of all humans. We're not going to do that here, but we will still kind of follow up on common themes about how outsiders come and exploit Africa. We'll see that in a few minutes. And so then we finally have Tarzan finding his parents' cabin. And notice the door is open in this version, as it was a bit more difficult to get in the novel. And then things proceed like the novel. He finds the books, he becomes fascinated by them, discovers his father's hunting knife, gets attacked by the gorilla, fights the gorilla, wins, but is gravely wounded and is nursed back to health by Kala. All right, before we get to issue 2, I just want to point out that Bawanga is a new character, and we're going to see several new characters in this origin. And why is that? Certainly in the novels, Tarzan had many black friends, but none of them are quite like Bawanga. So instead of just slapping an arbitrary name from the novels onto a new character, Dan Jurgens just creates a new character, and I think that's exactly how you should do things. And we'll see that actually with a character in this issue. And everything in issue 2 is going to be different from the novels, but it's going to get us to the exact same place. So like in the novels, he will return to his parents' cabin and be drawn to the books there, and he'll come over and over again. But this time in this version, he's not going to be able to make out the words, and he won't be able to teach himself how to read, but it still works because it shows his intelligence and his curiosity, and the books are still his link to humanity. He's still learning through the pictures and beginning to understand what a human is. This issue also introduces the villain of the storyline, Shaw, again, a new character, and Shaw basically comes to Africa looking to make some money. At first, he wants to loot a lost city, but he can't find it, so he tries to poach some animals, and when he stumbles upon Tarzan, he sees dollar signs and tries to capture him. And then Tarzan's ape mama Kala comes in to lay the smackdown on these fools and protect her son in a truly awesome scene. But then Shaw suddenly shoots her in the chest, and those of us who've read Tarzan of the Apes know exactly which scene in the novel this is. Tarzan does everything he can to try to save his mother. He carries her away and they dive off of a cliff. He carries her to the cabin, which he's never told anyone about. And he thinks he can save her, just like she tended his wounds when he was young. He thinks he can do the same here, but Kala knows that it's done. She knows she's going to die. And so with her last breaths, she confesses to her son where he really comes from. This is a confession we never got in the novels. Kala never got to tell Tarzan this. And to combine it with her death scene and to put it in this place, in this cabin, which is his link to his humanity, the same humans who just killed his mother. This is the cabin where his father died. This is the bed where he was born on. This is the bed where his biological mother died on. This is where he is losing the only mother he'd ever known. He is losing all of his parents in the same place. And I actually choked up reading that the first time. And I have never done that in a Tarzan story. It is certainly the most powerful, emotional scene I have ever seen in a Tarzan story. And not only is it great writing by Dan Jurgens, but the artwork by Benito Gallego is just perfect. And so thank you guys for putting a twist very unexpectedly on a scene that I think every Tarzan fan has seen done a million times, and just turning it into something new and powerful, but still getting us to a very similar point to where the novel got us. And so why have Shaw kill Kala? So in the novel, it is a hunter from the tribe of Mbonga, which is this vicious tribe of cannibals, and the hunter happens to be the chief's son. But really, the tribe of Mbonga are very one-dimensional villains in that first novel. They're basically just catalysts there to make the characters do various things. But when I look at the villains in the other novels, heck, you can even see this in the last half of Return of Tarzan, the villains tend to be white, and they tend to be products of either Western civilization or a variant of Western civilization, right? When you look at the Lost Cities, you see a lot of different, really parodies of society there, right? But most of the time, the villains were Westerners, right? You had Albert Werper and Nicholas Rockoff, Esteban Miranda, the list goes on. And they were typically coming to Africa to exploit it, right? They were going to do something bad to either the people or the animals there, or they were looking to loot it or whatever. And Tarzan is the guy who stands in their way. And that's not just true in the novels, but it also carries over to just about every version of the character that I can humanly think of. And so to tie Kala's death into that makes a lot of sense. All right, on to issue 3. So here we see Mbonga once again, and he is working with Lieutenant Henry Carson, who's going to play a major role in the origin. And so Carson is working for Commander Shaw, but he's a pretty decent guy. He just has a lousy boss. He's trying to attract a lion to capture. And of course, a lion does show up, but a little bit sooner than they'd hoped, and attacks Lieutenant Carson. And I like the fact that they've set up a reason for the lion to be there. Obviously, in the novels, which are not as grounded, there is a man-eating lion around every corner in Africa, it feels like. And of course, Tarzan shows up to save them, fighting the lion to the death. And the use of a lion is super appropriate Obviously, you can see behind me, it's very commonly used in the novels, and for good reason, right? Lions are the king of the beasts, right? And so if Tarzan can beat a lion, he can beat anybody. Tarzan reacts to the lion's death in a very somber way and doesn't take any joy in it. So this is a bit different than the novels, where Tarzan almost always puts his foot on the carcass of his kill and lets out the cry of the bull ape. Now, he is raised by less vicious apes, so it does make sense that he would take less pride in killing things, but I do wonder if that was something that was being held back for a moment in a future plot line where, some climactic moment, he would get a big splash page doing that. It could be, something similar to what they did in the Marvel movies with Captain America saying Avengers Assemble, right? He's always known for saying that, but Marvel didn't have him do that until Endgame. Could be something similar here. Lieutenant Carson is grievously wounded, but Tarzan nurses him back to health. And during that time, he teaches Tarzan how to speak English along with the help of Bawanga. And so, yes, Lieutenant Carson does fill the role that Paul Darno had in Tarzan of the Apes. But I do like that Bawanga in African is included in this education that they give Tarzan. And they do figure out he's a Greystoke. And they even speculate that perhaps he has grandparents who are alive. And every time I hear a mention of Tarzan's grandparents, of course, I think about Greystoke, and it does make me wonder if maybe that could have come up in a future plot line of, with the Tarzan having a grandfather. Tarzan meets Shaw again, but it ends up being kind of a standoff because Shaw has a bunch of guys with guns and apes in cages. And so Shaw tries to get Tarzan to go to a lost city and steal some jewels for him. And so now we're on issue 4, and from here on out, this will mostly go in its own direction and won't be using as much from Tarzan of the Apes. Tarzan is going to refuse Shaw and is going to threaten to unleash the apes on him if he hurts the captive ones. But then Shaw grabs Bawanga and threatens to kill him if Tarzan doesn't get him the jewels. And so Tarzan relents. And it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it's because Bawanga is his friend or because he's human, maybe a little bit of both. But Tarzan does agree to go on this quest for Shaw. And one of the great things here, and this is why I love Dan Jurgens' writing, is that he has Bawanga say that he's surprised that Shaw remembered his name, right? And that is just something that I can imagine someone thinking in that situation. It's like, my boss is going to kill me, but he remembered my name? It's just that type of little human quirk that I always loved in Dan Jurgens' work and also in Burroughs' work as well. And then we get the team up I never thought I would see. Kerchak helps Tarzan find this lost civilization. And it's just really unexpected. In the novels, him and Kerchak were enemies and Tarzan would have to eventually kill him. And so it's just kind of cool to see Kerchak on the side of the angels, at least for the moment. And so that brings us to the Valley of the Mist, where the lost city is. And so this is a valley covered in perpetual mist. And so if you're trying to come up with a plausible reason why no one has found a lost city, that's a pretty good one, right? No airplane could possibly see it because it's covered in mist. And it makes me wonder what else other than this first lost city is in this valley, right? Could there be other lost civilizations? Could Opar be down there? It just really makes me intrigued at what could have been done in future plot lines. And by the way, not only is the valley super hard to find, but it's almost impossible to get down there unless you're Tarzan. And so that's a pretty good reason for Tarzan to find a civilization of Africans living untouched by colonization in complete isolation. It is a functional, peaceful society. We get some interesting glimpses as Tarzan walks around. Also interesting to note is Tarzan grabs this cloth to cover himself up because he doesn't look like them and he doesn't want to stand out. But he leaves his head exposed. At first I thought this might be some kind of artistic mistake, but then it occurred to me he probably thinks he would stand out because he's not dressed like them. He wouldn't realize that his skin color would make him stand out because he doesn't understand, how humans perceive race. He has no reason to. He was raised by apes. And so he does find some jewels, and he does take those jewels. And this, of course, brings him into conflict with the inhabitants of the city. And they are dressed as traditional African warriors, so we do get to check off that box. And so now we move to issue 5. And we open with this really awesome battle between Tarzan and the warriors. And again, that iconic imagery of Tarzan fighting a group of warriors all by himself. He's captured, and that leads to another iconic Tarzan scene where he's about to be burned at the stake. But the chieftain is a decent guy, and he really doesn't want to do it. He's just kind of bound by law to execute him. Tarzan is able to win him over and convince him that he needs the sacred jewels to save his friend, and so the chieftain lets him have it, and Tarzan promises to someday return it. And I think that kind of debt that he owes him, saving Bwanga by letting him have the jewels, is one of the reasons why Tarzan is so willing, even all those years later, to fulfill that promise. Of course, Tarzan is also a man of his word and a man of deep integrity as well. Shaw, however, is not, and proceeds to shoot Tarzan, who falls into a river immediately after receiving the jewels. And of course, Tarzan being presumed dead is an element that has been in many, many Burroughs stories. So having that in there is just, again, another iconic thing to kind of check off that list. All right, the 6th and final issue. We open with a scene of unspeakable cruelty, as Shaw did indeed spare Bwanga, but since he has the jewels, he decides he no longer needs the captive apes, and it's just easier to kill them all. And we're very restrained in this. We basically just show Bwanga covering his ears and describing how horrible the screams are as the apes die. And I think that's a pretty good call to make. There's a lot of people who are very sensitive to that sort of thing. You can see the reactions to the final Guardians of the Galaxy movie by James Gunn. That may have gone a little bit too far in showing animal cruelty. So I think just describing it is more than enough for the reader. And of course, Tarzan is not dead, and he does come back to open a can of whoop ass on Shaw. And he fights beside Kerchak, who ends up being essentially a hero in this plot line, which is kind of cool. I know there are a lot of people who really like Kerchak's portrayal in the Disney movies, where he's a more noble character. And so this is kind of a treat for them. Tarzan defeats Shaw, but Lieutenant Carson begs Tarzan to spare his life. And so Tarzan does. He does break his arm, which kind of makes me wonder if next time we see Shaw, he might have a messed up arm. Tarzan letting a villain live is not all that unusual. I was actually kind of surprised how many times Tarzan either didn't kill the villain or just let him go at the end of the novels. But letting Shaw live in this instance, of course, lets him be a villain in the future. And I do wonder if that bounty on Tarzan's head that we see in the 1950s may have been put there by Shaw, because my speculation is perhaps he is in charge of something illegal in that future, or perhaps he even has a position with that government of that African country, right? Those corrupt policemen that we saw may have actually been working for Shaw. And so Shaw is kind of this living avatar of everything wrong with Western civilization, right? He's everything that Tarzan fights put into one person. And so we've seen that before, right, in like the movies and stuff like that. Clayton in the Disney film is probably one of the most well-known instances of that. I think Shaw works better, though, than any time I've seen that done on the screen, because Shaw is just more connected with Tarzan's mythos than any of those others, right? He killed Kala. He's after the treasure of a lost city. And he is incredibly cruel in ways that you probably just can't do on TV or movies most of the time, in the way he massacred those innocent apes. Speaking of apes that aren't quite as innocent, we have Kerchak, who does survive this plot line. And even though they're allies here, we do indicate that Kerchak is very resentful of what the humans did to the apes, and it does speak to possible conflict between Tarzan and Kerchak in the future. Speaking of setups for the next plot line, Tarzan, laying on a tree branch, very ape-like, watches Shaw retreat from Africa and leave on a boat. Shaw, of course, secretly had the jewels on him. But after he leaves, Tarzan sees another boat come to shore, and this has, of course, Jane in it. And so this is probably her father, Professor Porter, is my guess. And they don't seem to be under any distress. We're not quite sure why they're there, but they don't seem to be held hostage like in the novels. So that would have been a very, very interesting next plot line. And so the framing sequence with Old Man Tarzan ends with Tarzan rescuing Bwanga from the corrupt police, and they escape. And then we pick up in the 1960s, and we discover the entire story that we have been reading has been Bwanga telling his grandchildren about his friend Tarzan. And then we get to see an even older Tarzan and Jane. This is in the 1960s, so presumably they're probably in their 70s or 80s. Age does catch up to you at that point, but Tarzan still wants to go back to Africa. He says they belong there and he's already booked the trip. And of course, this would lead into the framing sequence for the next plot line. And so there's a lot of intriguing elements to that second plot line. Bwanga mentions that he would have many different adventures with Tarzan throughout his life. And also, in the Valley of the Mist, the people there indicate that Tarzan goes back to the Valley of the Mist repeatedly, and he becomes their friend. I really get kind of Waziri vibes out of them. I can certainly see them, following Tarzan into battle, backing him up against whatever else is in the Valley of the Mist, which I would have been very, very intrigued to see. But mostly, I would be very intrigued to see an entire plot line revolving around Tarzan meeting Jane. I mean, it just definitely teases the imagination, and I would love to see that relationship approached that way. Unfortunately, there is no indication that the second plot line is going to happen, and I think that's a shame because the first 6 issues set up a first part of a terrific blueprint of how you can do a version of Tarzan's origin in other medium. I mean, I could easily see this being adapted to the screen very easily, but unfortunately it's only part of the origin, right? A lot of it is him meeting Jane, and unfortunately I don't know if we're ever going to see that in this version of the story. But if you've watched my video about the other Tarzan of the Apes adaptations, you know it's not unusual for creators not to be able to make it all the way through that novel when they're adapting it. Maybe the novel is just cursed. I don't know. I think it is definitely a shame in this case, but I really, really enjoyed what we were given, and I want to thank everyone involved for giving us an amazing 6-issue plot line that shows Tarzan at his best. But even if we don't get the second plot line in this particular series, I'm sure that the return of Tarzan to comic book shelves is inevitable. Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. is working on its own graphic novel that's going to be available on Kickstarter and through their website. I expect that might come out next year, but we'll see. Mike Wolfer is working on it. Ironically, next week I plan to review the new Conan #1, which is on track to be one of the highest selling comics of the decade. But for Tarzan, I've got plenty of retro reviews coming. Edgar Rice Burroughs Inc. is working on various projects, including Moon Maid trade paperback Kickstarter. And so like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.